What if a country just decided to hit the pause button on the entire world for over 2 centuries? Well, that's pretty much exactly what Japan did during its incredible Edo period. It created this unique, self-contained universe. So let's dive into how they did it and what life was like on the inside.
I mean, really think about that for a second. No outside news, no international travel, basically zero influence from other cultures. What would a society like that even look like? Well, Japan ran that exact experiment, and it led to one of the longest periods of peace in history and a massive cultural boom.
And we're not talking about a short-term thing. This lasted from 1603 all the way to 1868. That is 250 years of stability, an entire era without a single major war. It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around that.
So, this policy had a name, Sakoku, which basically means closed country. And the rules were dead simple. Foreigners, you're not allowed in. Japanese citizens, you're not allowed out. The whole point was to maintain total control and to keep foreign ideas, especially from Christian missionaries, from spreading.
Okay, so how on earth do you keep an entire country under wraps for that long? Well, it all came down to a super rigid social structure, kind of like a pyramid, with one person at the very top holding all the power.
Now, you might think the emperor was in charge, right? But nope. During this time, the emperor was more of a spiritual figurehead. The person with the real power was the shogun. He was the top military commander, and he ran the show from his massive castle in a city called Edo, which you might know today as Tokyo.
Just below the shogun, you had the daimyo. These guys were powerful lords who ruled over their own chunks of Japan. But they had to be completely 100% loyal to the shogun, who, by the way, had a very clever system to make sure they never even thought about stepping out of line. So here's how the shogun kept these powerful lords on a leash. It was genius, really. First, every single daimyo had to spend every other year living in the capital, Edo. Second, when it was their year to go back home, they had to leave their entire family behind in Edo, basically as hostages. And the kicker? The daimyo had to pay for all of this themselves. The travel, the 2 households, everything. It kept them too broke and too busy to ever plan a rebellion.
And it wasn't just the lords who were controlled. The whole of society was split into 4 strict classes. Your rank was decided the moment you were born. At the top, you had the samurai, the warriors and government officials. Right below them were the farmers, who were super important because they grew all the food. Then came the artisans who made things. And way down at the bottom were the merchants. And moving up that ladder, yeah, that was pretty much impossible.
So, with this lockdown in effect, and this rigid social pyramid, what was daily life actually like for the people living inside this system? Well, for the samurai at the top, life was governed by a strict honor code. And since there were no wars, they became the government administrators. On the other hand, you have the farmers. They made up most of the population and were the backbone of the economy, growing the rice that was literally used as currency for taxes. But despite how important they weren't allowed to leave their land and often lived pretty tough lives.
And this created one of the biggest ironies of the whole period. The merchants were at the very bottom of the social ladder. Why? Because they didn't technically produce anything with their hands. But as the economy grew, many of them became incredibly, fantastically wealthy, sometimes even richer than the high and mighty samurai who looked down on them.
All of this life and energy was buzzing in the capital, Edo. By the 18th century, it had a population of over 1 million people. To put that in perspective, that made it one of the biggest cities on the entire planet, all inside a country that was completely cut off from the rest of the world.
So what happens when a country has 250 years of peace with no outside distractions? Well, you get a cultural golden age. With no wars to fight, people poured all that time and energy into art, theater, and learning. It was an explosion of creativity.
This period gave us so many art forms that are still world famous today. You've got the rise of kabuki theater with its over-the-top costumes and makeup. There was bunraku puppetry, using these incredibly detailed puppets to tell epic stories. And of course, the iconic ukiyo-e woodblock prints. Even things like the tea ceremony and garden design were perfected into the beautiful, disciplined arts we know now.
And you know what's really cool? This wasn't just for the elites. Because society was so stable, education became way more common. Regular people could go to schools run at local temples to learn reading, writing, and math. This meant Japan had a surprisingly high literacy rate for this period in history.
But no bubble can last forever. After more than 2 centuries of quiet isolation, the outside world came knocking. And this time, it was not going to take no for an answer.
At the same time, the system was starting to show some cracks from the inside.
The government was running into some serious money problems, and a few major famines made a lot of people unhappy and questioned the shogun's rule.
And then, the final blow. In 1853, American warships sailed right into Edo Bay and demanded that Japan open up for trade. The shogun knew his samurai swords were no match for modern cannons, so he was forced to sign a treaty. This one event set off a huge crisis. Just a few years later, in 1868, the last shogun resigned, power went back to the emperor, and just like that, the Edo period was over. Japan's 250-year isolation had come to a dramatic end.
So this leaves us with a huge question. After 2.5 centuries of peace and quiet, Japan was suddenly forced to modernize at a dizzying, lightning-fast speed. What actually happens when an entire nation is forced to play catch-up with the rest of the world, basically overnight?